All right, class, we're going to get started with the basics of poetry. This is the beginning of a long path leading up until the AP test that you're going to take your senior year, which is going to be heavily reliant on poetry. So you're going to expect to see a good portion of that test covering poetry. So this is our starting point. I'm sure you have some experience with poetry before, but this is going to make sure that we're all kind of starting off on the same page here. So do you want to learn how to analyze poetry? Well, this is the way. All right. So we're going to start with the general structure of poetry. I'm going to kind of move that away there so we have a view of everything. All right. So poetry has structure. All writing has structure. So poetry structure is just a little bit different from what we're used to when we're writing prose, right? Prose being non-poetry. So we have poetry and we have prose. And so prose is all of that other writing that we do. All right. So keep this in mind. Poetry is just writing, but it's writing with short lines. It has rhythm. It may have a rhyme. Now, at this point, we're all pretty clear on the fact that poetry doesn't have to have rhyme for it to be poetry, but many poems do. All right. It has language that affects the reader's emotions and imagination, and that is the key. That's what we're going for with poetry. Okay. And my clicker stopped working here, so I'm going to go ahead and just click through to the next one. All right. So though poetry varies greatly in what it looks and sounds like, all poems have some sort of structure. Okay. And that structure is the lines and the stanzas. Now, the meter and rhyme, that's the kind of pattern within that structure. All right. So we're going to cover what lines and stanzas are. These are those components of the poem. The meter and rhyme is kind of that rhythm to it, but these are the components. All right. So a line is simply what it sounds like. A line is writing on one line. As soon as you move down to the next line, you have a new line. Okay. It's not one sentence in poetry. In fact, one sentence of the poem may run for many lines. Okay. Or a poem itself may be one sentence total. Okay. And possibly even less. It could be a sentence fragment, depending on how the poem that's being written. Where the line ends, so wherever you move from line 1 down to line 2 and so on and so forth, that place where the line stops and you move down to the next one is what we call a break or a line break. All right. Lines of poetry can be a variety of lengths depending on the effects the poem is going for. Line lengths are different within the same poem in many cases. So you may have a line that's 5 lines long and the following one may only, a line that's 5 words long and then the following one may only be 1 or 2 words. Yes, it's possible for a line to be as short as one single word. And in a couple of cases like A and I, that line could be a single letter. All right. But it's clearly a word. Okay. When you're reading, one doesn't pause at each line break. Rather, one pauses with the punctuation marks like when reading prose. Okay, so this is a standard kind of idea, but it's debatable. Typically, when we're reading poems, people will pause at the end of the line. It's kind of a reader's choice. So I, myself, pause at the end of the lines. That's just the way that I'm used to reading poetry. Okay. And finally, lines in poems are often devices that are created simply for rhyme scheme or even decoration. The poet never arbitrarily chooses line breaks. Just like any other kind of writing, it's planned, it's drafted, it's worked out. So lines just don't end willy-nilly. There's some thought put into that. So because of that, when we're analyzing poems, we need to think about where the line breaks to understand why the author chose to do that. We need to try to figure that out. Okay. So stanzas, if we compare a line to a sentence, even though it's not, it may not be a complete sentence, a stanza is like a paragraph. Okay, so it's a group of lines where a paragraph is a group of sentences, a stanza is a group of lines. Okay, and so a stanza in poetry is like a paragraph in prose. It is a body of lines put together for effect. Okay, stanzas are identified by the number of lines they contain. So we have names of stanzas based on the number of lines. So we see this chart over to the side here. If I have 2 lines before I skip a line for a line break, then those 2 lines grouped together in a stanza are a couplet. 3 is a tercet, 4 is a quatrain, 5 is a cinquain. Okay, that may sound familiar. We actually have a type of poetry called a cinquain that has 5 lines. Okay, but you can have other types of poems that aren't named cinquain but still have 5 lines. It's a cinquain stanza. All right. A sestet has 6 lines. A septet has 7 lines, and octet has 8 lines. And then from 9 and farther, we just call it the number of lines for the stanza. Okay, I'm not going to test you on this when you take your poetry test. I'm not going to ask you to have these memorized, but I will tell you by the time you get to your senior year, you will have these memorized because it's a necessity on the AP test. Right now, I'm just making you aware that this is a thing. Okay, all right. Now, the most common numbers of lines per stanza in poetry are 3, 4, and 5. And that's just doing a statistical analysis. This is what's most common in poetry. Okay. Often the number of stanzas used in a poem is totally determined by the poet, although there are some specific types of poems that require a certain number of lines and stanzas. We're going to learn about many of these throughout our AP English career. However, we're going to learn a couple of them today with our lessons. We're going to talk about haikus, cinquains, which we've already discussed, and limericks, and these have required number of lines and stanzas. Okay, so we have this poem here, and this is a poem from my childhood. You may have heard of it, you may not, but this poem is, "What are little boys made of? What are little boys made of? Frogs and snails and puppy dogs' tails. That's what little boys are made of. What are little girls made of? What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and all that's nice. That's what little girls are made of." Now, we're not going to get into all of the problematic areas of gender stereotypes and that sort of thing in this poem. It was a kid's poem long ago, all right? But we are going to look at the structure of this poem. So I'm going to kind of move in here. So I'm going to minimize this because, man, that's weird. All right. So we have what are little boys made of? Okay. And then we move down to the next line. Now, that's a line break. Okay. Now, it's also a complete sentence in this case. But then we move down to the next one. What are little boys made of? It's another line. It's also a complete sentence. But frogs and snails is not a complete sentence, but our poet decides to give it its own line. And puppy dog's tails, again, it's a line, but not a complete sentence. That's what little boys are made of. This is a line and a sentence. So we have sentence, sentence, fragment, fragment, sentence. Okay, something when we're analyzing we need to look at. But it is 5 lines, which means it is a cinquain. Okay, but it's 3 complete sentences. Well, yeah, 3 sentences. 1, 2, 3, and then these 2 fragments. All right. So then we move. Oh yeah, I guess frogs and snails and puppy dogs' tails. All right. Anyway, then we move to a stanza break. So this is where we skip a line and start the next stanza, and then we follow the same pattern. Okay, and so that gives us a rhythm to the poem along with the lines and stanzas. Okay. All right. So just what you need to remember is we also have meter and rhyme, okay? And so we need to, let's see, I'm going to put that back up there. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and look at meter. Okay, so the meter of the poem is its rhythm or its pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, and it's measured in units of feet. Okay, we call them feet, stressed and unstressed syllables, and it's a group of syllables that are stressed and or unstressed. So that group is what's called a foot. Okay, and so I'm going to move this little thing over here so that we can see that clearly. All right, here we go. Just like the names of stanzas depend on the number of lines, the name of a line in a poem depends on the number of feet it contains. So again, this is an introduction. I'm not going to expect you to memorize this, but if a metric foot has one syllable, it's going to be manometer. Okay, two syllables, or sorry, 2 feet, so groups of syllables, is going to be dimeter. 3 feet is going to be trimeter. Then we have tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, and octameter. And we really don't get much higher than that. An octameter is pretty rare. Again, my expectation is that you don't have this memorized. I just want you to know that this is a thing that eventually you will grow to truly comprehend and be able to identify. Okay, so there are some common meters that you will need to know. Those are Shakespeare. He wrote an iambic pentameter. We've talked about this before. It's groups of stressed and unstressed syllables. So a foot, we have 5 feet of, so penta, 5, right, of iambs, which is a stressed and an unstressed syllable. So Shakespeare wrote in that. Homer wrote in trochaic hexameter, right? So this is the hardest concept when you're dealing with poetic structure. Again, you'll deal with it a little bit more as you move on to your sophomore and senior year. All right. Okay. So we're gonna look at this, and I'm gonna kind of go through how this works. This is one of Shakespeare's sonnets, right? Each line has 5 sets of iambic metric feet. So an iamb is 2 syllables, stressed and unstressed. So each line is going to have 10 syllables because it's got 5 sets of those 2 syllable feet. So let me just read through this, and I'm going to show you how this works out. First of all, I'm just going to read it as I normally would, and then I'm going to read it through so that you can identify those feet. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often it is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines by chance or nature's changing course intrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So you may not see as you're reading or as you're hearing along with it, you may not get the pattern there. But let me read through it, really enunciating those stressed and unstressed syllables. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. Now I could go through the rest of this, but it's just going to be really monotonous. But that is how we see those stressed and unstressed syllables. And this is what Shakespeare wrote in. We see it in all of his, we see it in much of his work. Sometimes he switches from this poetic to this kind of these different formats. But most of the time, his characters are going to be speaking in iambic pentameter, and his poetry is going to be in iambic pentameter. Let me give you an example. But soft what light through yonder window breaks, 'tis the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon that is already sick and pale with grief. Okay, so we have this, the beginning of the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. Many of you are familiar with that. But soft what light through yonder window breaks. But soft what light through yonder window breaks. Okay, so we see that pattern. Macbeth, I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked. I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked. Okay, so we see these patterns that appear. Now, Shakespeare, we talked about this with memorization in Shakespeare and how that helps his characters memorize, having that pattern, putting it to a song. But this pattern can be kind of de-emphasized as you're reading through the poem, but it's still there. Okay, and we see that not just with iambic pentameter, but different poets choose different patterns for their poetry. Okay. Then we have rhyme. Okay. And rhyme is different from meter because rhyme is more of a sound device. Okay, so the rhyme of a poem is the repetition of a sound within it. It can rhyme internally or at the end of lines and or stanzas, and some poems don't have rhyme at all. Just remember that. Okay, this portion of poetry structure is the most varying and unique per poem. The poet kind of gets to play with this. All right, however they prefer. Okay, sorry, I'm bouncing myself all over here. Let's move up here now. All right, let's try that. Okay, so we have rhyme scheme. Okay, and the rhyme scheme is a terminology we use to indicate the pattern of the rhymes within a unit of verse, typically a stanza. All right, so the scheme is represented by letters A, B, C, maybe D, E. It depends on how much rhyme is within the poem. Okay, so let's take a look at this other Shakespeare poem. Take, oh, take those lips away that so sweetly were forsworn, and those eyes, the break of day, lights that do mislead the morn. But my kisses bring again, seals of love, but sealed in vain, sealed in vain. Okay, so we see that the A lines end with away and day, and the B lines end with forsworn and mourn, rhyming words. And then we see that the C lines end with again and vain. Again and vain. That's what we call a slant rhyme, or a rhyme that we're kind of forcing, right? But Shakespeare didn't say again, right, when he was speaking. He said again, like we do. But again rhymes with vain. So we kind of force that rhyme there. But what we have now, because away and day rhyme and forsworn and mourn rhyme and again and vain rhyme, we have what's called an AB, AB, CC rhyme scheme. So you just A, B, A, B, C, C. And that's a way of mapping out the rhyme. Okay. Now, there's all kinds of types of rhyme in poetry, and some of these you may not even consider rhyme, but they are what is considered rhyme in poetry. We have what's called an end rhyme, and those examples that we just saw, and I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end, right? So we have friend and end rhyming. That's an end rhyme. It's a rhyme that occurs at the end of a line. It's the most common type, okay? But then we have internal rhyme, and this is rhyme that occurs in the middle of a line of poetry. Okay, the splendor falls on castle walls and snowy summits old in story. The long light shakes across the lakes and the wild cataract leaps in glory. So we have this internal rhyme where falls and walls and shakes and lakes. But notice we also have end rhyme with story and glory. Okay, so there's two types of rhyme in that. Then we have that half slant rhyme. I talked about it before, where we're kind of forcing a rhyme that's not really there. In the mustard seed sun, by full tilt river and switchback sea, where the cormorant scud in his house on stilts high among the beaks. Okay, guys, this is a type of rhyme that you should be very familiar with. Songwriters use this a lot where they're forcing a rhyme that's not really there. They're mispronouncing a word purposefully to make it rhyme. Some of the best examples of slant rhyme you're going to find in hip hop and rap, because we just have this kind of constant barrage of rhyming, and there's just not enough options to have this perfect rhyme. So we have this half slant or forced rhyme. And it's just kind of an awesome use of language in that case. All right, then we have assonance. Now, you may not think of assonance as rhyme, but it does still kind of fit into that concept in poetry. It's the repetition of two or more vowel sounds within a line. So burnt the fire of thine eyes. So fire, thine, and eyes don't rhyme in the traditional sense, but it's that hard I sound that we see that repetition. And so it falls in that category. And then we have consonants. And so it's the same as assonance, except it's a repetition of consonant sounds. So, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell the soil. Okay. So we have that D sound repeated. And in the second line, we have that S sound repeated over and over again. And so that's that consonants. And you're familiar with alliteration. We've talked about this before. It's a repetition of one or more initial sound, usually consonants in words within a line. So bright black-eyed creature brushed with brown. So that repetition of that beginning consonant sound. Okay, it could be a vowel sound at the beginning, but typically we're talking about consonant sounds. And we use alliteration a lot in language, and you may also notice that alliteration is used a lot with literary characters' names. So, you know, we have those characters that come up that have that alliterative name. Most common, you're going to see it in cartoon and comic book characters. So you have like your Bruce Banner or your Clark Kent sort of characters. So you have these repetitions of those alliterative names. All right, so other poetry terms, devices, and interpretation. We're going to have a list of other devices found within poetry, as well as terms needed to interpret poetry. So these are some terms that you may already be familiar with, but you're going to need to make sure that you're familiar with as we continue on. Without these, poem would not have the effect the reader's emotion. It would not affect the reader's emotions and imagination. Sorry about that. Which is the point of poetry, right? Readers would not be able to properly interpret the meanings of poetry without these devices. So we are going to take a look at those. So, of course, simile, this is probably one of the first literary devices that you learned as a child. It's a comparison of two unlike objects using like or as. The holy time is quiet as a nun. So the holy time, it's quiet just like a nun is quiet. Okay, that would be a simile. Okay, then we have, my wallet is like an onion. When I open it, it makes me cry. Okay? Simile, using like. Then we have metaphor. And a metaphor is a comparison of unlike objects by substitution using to be verbs. So instead of saying like or as, it's saying they are the same. Death is a broom. Okay? Death and broom are the same, without using that like or as. And a metaphor is any comparison. Okay. All right. Then we have, I'm going to try to stay right over here. I'm just bouncing all over the screen. All right. Then we have personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which inanimate objects are given human characteristics. Okay, so shadows hold their breath. Shadows are not animate. They are given human characteristics. So non-human objects given human characteristics. So this term saying inanimate objects here isn't exactly true, because we can give animate objects like animals human characteristics and it's still personification. This house example there as well. Now, synecdoche is one that you've probably not heard of before. And this is a figure of speech in which a part represents the whole object or idea. Okay, so saying not a hair perished is saying nobody was hurt, right? But we're just talking about their hair. We're not talking about the whole person. So that hair is representing the whole person. Another example here that you may have heard, when we talk about a military maneuver where we're putting people on another country's soil, we say there are boots on the ground. We're not just throwing a bunch of boots at this other country. That would be the strangest form of warfare ever, right? No, we're putting soldiers with their boots on the ground, but the boots represent the soldiers. And we see this a lot. When my dad was growing up, when he was about your age, when they would go out, when the guys would go out, trying to meet girls, they referred to it as chasing skirts. Okay. Yeah, well, it's inappropriate and all of that. But that was what the term that they used for going out and trying to meet girls. They were chasing skirts. So that skirt is representing the girl themselves. Maybe when people at the office are getting a little worried because the bosses are coming in, they talk about the suits, right? Because the people that wear suits, they're the higher ups. And so they're concerned. They're referring to them as the suits. So we see this a lot. It's where one piece represents the larger group. Okay. Onomatopoeia. Again, this is one that you've probably heard of before. It's the use of a word whose sound suggests its meaning. So buzz sounds like its meaning. Okay. Meow sounds like its meaning. It's the word that we use for, the sound a cat makes. We used to call these Batman words when I was a kid, because there was an old Batman TV show that whenever a character would punch another character, they would flash like pow or bang or oof on the screen. And so those were these onomatopoetic words. So we have this example here of the cat with the machine gun saying pew, pew, pew. Those are examples of onomatopoeia. Now, hyperbole, again, one you probably heard of, is that gross exaggeration for effect. It's a purposeful overstatement. Okay, my sister has always done this and see, there's a little hyperbole there. When she talks about money, no matter how much something costs, if it's expensive in her eyes, it costs like $1 million. So if it was an expensive candy bar, she would say it costs like $1 million. Doesn't literally, but it's expensive. A house that was way too expensive costs like $1 million, or a car costs like $1 million. That's it's just something she's always done. It's that hyperbole. Okay. This little example, I love this one. It's impossible to think of a hyperbole meme. Well, it's not, because they've clearly done that. All right. Then we have irony. And irony is the contrast between actual meaning and the suggestion of another meaning. So we've talked about irony before. I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've probably heard the song. If not, look up Isn't It Ironic by Alanis Morissette. And it's like a meta irony. It's digging deeper into irony. We'll talk more about that later. But there are three types of irony. Okay, there's verbal irony, dramatic irony, and situational irony. And you need to be aware of the differences between them. Okay, verbal irony is meaning one thing and saying another. Typically, we talk about verbal irony as being sarcasm. Okay, so this example here, I hate when people see me at the supermarket and they're like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And I'm just like, "Oh, hunting elephants." Okay. So it's a sarcastic response, meaning one thing and saying something else. And then there's dramatic irony. Now, dramatic irony has two levels of meaning. It's what the speaker of the poem intends versus what the author intends, right? It occurs when the reader or audience are in possession of knowledge of which the characters are not, okay? So we have the speaker, the character within the poem, they mean one thing, but the author of the poem means something else. So we know what's really going down. Now, we see this a lot in film and TV, and that is where we know what's going to happen, but the characters don't. And that kind of makes us uncomfortable or a little nervous or excited, right? So we see this example, like we know that the monster is behind the kitty, but the kitty doesn't know that. And so we're like, oh no, it's right behind you. That's dramatic irony. It gets us like excited. This is the monster in the closet sort of moment, or when the character does something, but we know it's not going to turn out well for them, that sort of thing. So that's dramatic irony. And then we have situational irony. And this occurs when events turn out quite differently from what the characters and readers expect. Okay. And so we have this example here. It's not what we expect, right? We have this author who writes a book about no more plastic, and the book comes prepackaged in plastic. And of course, Obi-Wan says you've become the very thing you swore to destroy, right? So these are those plot twists that we don't expect to happen. Another Star Wars reference. I remember being destroyed emotionally in the early 80s when I found out that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. Sorry, spoilers. Or watching the movie The Sixth Sense and finding out that the character that we thought was helping the child was actually dead all along. Okay, I'll avoid any other spoilers from here. But these are those twists. All right. Then we have symbolism. And symbolism is when a person, object, or idea in the poem has a literal and figurative meaning. And we've talked about symbolism before in this class, like the American flag. It is literally a piece of fabric with some red and blue and white dye, right? That's what it is literally. But it has a much stronger figurative meaning. It means more internally to people. And it has various meaning depending on the person and the situation, right? We have other symbols like the international symbol for maybe I'll make 2 sandwiches. I'm not sure yet, right? Whenever I've shown this in class, I get several students that kind of nod their head. They know that's what this means, right? All right, so then we have imagery, and we've talked about imagery throughout our literary analysis, but it's important in poetry too. These are pictures painted within a poem using those 5 sense descriptions, right? Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, all right? There are 2 kinds of imagery. There's abstract, which alludes to an image. We talk about red, white, and blue, flag of liberty. I don't need to say the American flag. We know what that is, right? Or then there's that concrete, which is using specific image, unshackling the chains and sprinting free, right? So we have that literal image, that concrete, versus the abstract where we just mention it and we let the reader figure out what we're actually referring to. So diction is the poetic device that's the author's word choice within a poem. It's the words the authors choose. Do they choose complex or very simplistic? Do they switch between? Are they using slang? Are they using a dialect? This is the diction of the poem. So we need to make sure that the reader knows the word that they mean, right? All right, a little Inigo Montoya there. And then tone is the author's attitude towards the subject of the poem. And this sometimes confuses readers because we need to remember that just like any other literature, the author and the speaker in the poem could be 2 different people, okay? Just like in novels, the author isn't the main character. It may be based off of them, but I can tell you that J.K. Rowling's wasn't a 12-year-old boy going to a school for magic, right? She created a character, and that character is the one that experiences the story. Poetry is the same way. So the author could create a character that they don't like to express their point. Or they can create a character that's dealing with a subject in a different way than they would deal with the subject. And that's what tone is. It's understanding that author's attitude about the subject, the characters within the poem. And we're going to read a poem where clearly the author feels one way and the character feels a different way. And so the author is almost making fun of that character within their poem. And so you can think of it as like the tone of the voice of the author. All right. And then we have the mood. And this is the emotional response that the poem simulates within its reader. Poetry is going to affect mood. Okay. One of the most common form of poetry that you guys encounter almost on a daily basis, many of you on an hourly basis, is of course music, right? Lyrical music. And that lyrical music, where we're talking about words, right? People have written a poem and put it to music, right? It's supposed to stimulate an emotion. That's the mood of the poem. What is it trying to get you to feel? All right. So we have It's a Dark and Stormy Night, right? It's going to start to elucidate some feelings there. And then we have the theme. And by now, if you don't understand that theme is a lesson, then I'm concerned for you, right? But it's the deeper meaning, or what are we supposed to learn from the poem? Okay. What's your point? Now, some terms that you need to know as we're interpreting poem, we're going to go through a list of them here. First is literal. And literal is the surface level meaning of a word, object, person, or idea. What's on the surface? Okay. So if I'm in my classroom, so I'm looking at a desk. A desk, literally, it's a place where a student sits to learn. Okay. And so, like this example, you know what really grinds my gears? Rust. Okay. So literally, gears, metal gears, right? They start to grind because of rust. That's literal. Okay. Figurative is the deeper meaning of a word, object, person, or idea. So I'm looking at my classroom, I'm looking at a desk, right? And so what does that make me feel? Okay. Now for me, I love the idea of being in my classroom and seeing these desks and imagining students sitting in the desk, because that's the feeling of kind of this. To me, it's almost like home. It's what I do and what I love, right? But for some of you, maybe that desk means, being contained, captured, forced to be stuck in one place, right? I hope that's not the case, but that's how that feeling that it caused. So the figurative can be interpreted, right? So looking at another figurative, so we have, what really grinds my gears? When Netflix has the sequel to a movie, but not the original. All right. So in this case, grinding my gears makes me frustrated, right? That's what the word or the phrase grinding my gears means. All right. Then we have denotation, which is the dictionary definition of a word. Like home, it's the place where you live. It's the denotation. Okay. It's what you would find in the dictionary, the actual literal meaning. Connotation is that figurative meaning, the emotional meaning of a word. Home, it's a place of comfort where you can be yourself and let your hair down. Maybe for somebody it's not, right? Maybe home has a different emotional meaning. But words have definitions and then they have feelings. Then we have objective, and we've talked about this. You have objective tests, right? These are when something has a definite meaning, a right or wrong. So there's multiple choice tests, right? But subjective is where something is open to interpretation. Okay, it's like an essay test, right? It takes a little more. I can grade an objective test super easy. I can let the computer do that. Subjective tests, I'm going to need to go through and see kind of those that interpretation within. Next, we have context. This is the set of facts or circumstances shaping a poet's purpose and meaning. So what's going on outside when the poet wrote the poem? Okay. If we know that the poet was living through a time of war, that's going to help us to understand inside. If they were living through a plague, that's going to help us understand. If they were living in a time of peace out in the woods, nobody else around, that's going to help us understand the poem. So what's going on inside and out? And there's also these cultural impacts or these gender impacts. Who wrote the poem? Where do they come from? What is their background? These are important pieces of context to understand when analyzing a poem. Okay. And then we have relative. It's in terms of poetry. This term means that interpretation of a poem's meaning is relative to the experience and background of both the poet and the reader. And if you've learned nothing else coming out of my class, it's that literature, all literature, including poetry, is a conversation. It's a conversation between the reader, me, and the author, whoever wrote the poem or the book or the memoir or what have you, right? So what I bring into that conversation is going to impact how I understand that poem, what I get out of it. And what the author brings into the poem is going to impact that as well. So we're having this conversation where they're expressing their thoughts and I'm taking them in and mixing them in with the stuff that I already know and have experienced and have learned and have loved and have hated and all of those things. And then I'm going to get an interpretation of the poem. This is why I love working with poetry, because when we discuss this poetry, we're going to see two people read the same poem and get very different interpretations of the poem. And that's okay, as long as they can support it with the text and with their own experiences. If they can put those together and come up with their interpretation, they just need to be able to support it. All right. So as we're wrapping this up, we need to know there seem to be endless types of poetry in existence. It makes recognizing types overwhelming to many people, but once you learn the basic categories, the identification process will be much easier. Okay, and so as we continue to work through, we'll get more and more comfortable with poetry. Okay, so there are two basic all-encompassing types of poetry. All right. So there are these two types, and then there are subcategories within. So there's lyric poetry. So think of song lyrics, right? It's subjective, it's reflective poetry with regular rhyme scheme and meter that reveals the poet's thoughts and feelings to create a single unique impression. This poetry is song-like and highly personal. Okay, it's the most common type of poetry. But then we have narrative poetry. It's not dealing with those feelings and thoughts on a granular, specific basis. It's not as dramatic in that way. It's objective verse with a regular rhyme scheme and meter that relates a story or narrative. So this is those long form poems, right, that are telling a story in poetry form. It's story-like. It's less personal and specific to the reader and the writer. Okay. Now, there's a chart here on the next slide that's going to cover the subcategories of all of those. And we're not really going to spend a lot of time focusing on these because you guys are not there yet. We're going to deal with more general and then work towards specific over the next couple of years. But just to give you an idea, this is the chart, and we have, let me move this to where we can see all of it. All right. So notice that some of them have a rhyme scheme, some do not. Some require specific content, and some do not. Okay. So these are requirements if you're going to if you're going to choose to write that particular type of poem. Now, there are no poetry police that are going to get mad if you write a sonnet that is, 15 lines, but it's not really a sonnet at that point. Okay. Or if you write a haiku that's not about nature, nobody's going to come in and like attack you because of this. But some might say, well, it's not a haiku. It's just a 3-line poem with 5 syllables. So, if somebody wants to be super pedantic, right, and argue you on that, you can say, whatever. Yes, it's my poem, right? So now, for purposes of exercises and practice and that sort of thing, I may specifically require some of these things, or your teachers might. But just know that this is this is kind of the general format. So we have odes, dramatic monologues, and idylls. These are our lyric poems. Epics and ballads, these are narrative poems. And these can be either lyric or narrative. Sonnets, viennaise, elegies, light verse, haiku, limerick, blank verse, and I've covered up the last one, free verse, yes. So these are all types of poetry. All right, and so that brings us to the end of our presentation here. And so we're going to continue to work with poetry, but come back and review this presentation. I'll post both the video version and the presentation itself for reference.